June 1945. The Texas sun hung like a furnace in the white-blue sky, and the air over Camp Hearn shimmered with heat and dust. A convoy of olive-drab trucks crawled down the gravel road, their engines rumbling in tired rhythm. Inside sat the defeated architects of Hitler's war, German generals who had once commanded divisions stretching across Europe, now silent men with dust on their medals. The smell of diesel and sweat mixed with the faint sweetness of cut grass from beyond the wire fences. For the first time in years, the sound of birds and laughter replaced the thunder of artillery. Each truck was marked U.S. Army, bold white letters that gleamed under the sun like a final verdict. Private Harold Simmons, age 21, leaned from the tailgate of one vehicle, chewing on a piece of gum, his rifle slung lazily over his shoulder. To him, these weren't monsters or masterminds, just tired old men in wrinkled gray uniforms. "Hard to believe," he whispered to a fellow guard. "These fellas once ran the war." Inside, the generals avoided each other's eyes, their pride worn thin by captivity. One adjusted the collar of his tunic as if to remind himself of rank. Another clutched his cap tightly, as though afraid even that might be taken from him. When the truck stopped before the gates, the men looked up. A wooden sign read, "Camp Hearn, Texas, U.S. Army Internment Camp." A few American soldiers played baseball in the distance, their laughter echoing faintly. A radio played swing music from a mess hall window, Benny Goodman light and careless. For the Germans, it was a sound from another world, one that didn't understand defeat. They were ordered out of the trucks. The guards didn't bark commands. They spoke plainly, even politely. "All right, gentlemen, step this way. You'll be processed and assigned quarters." The generals, still expecting humiliation, formed a neat line. They were used to fear, not civility. A tall, silver-haired man in his 50s, who had once commanded an entire panzer corps, stepped forward. "Water," he said simply, his accent thick but his tone dignified. The request carried the exhaustion of a man who'd crossed more battlefields than he could count. The Texan sergeant in charge, Sergeant Walter Kane, a man barely 30, with sunburned skin and easy humor, glanced toward the supply truck, then grinned. "Water?" he said. "Sure thing, General, but I think we can do a little better than that." He motioned to a young private who disappeared into the mess hall and returned moments later carrying a metal cooler packed with ice. The sergeant popped the lid, and the sharp hiss of cold air drew the German's attention. Inside were glass bottles of Coca-Cola, the labels bright red against the frost. The sergeant handed the first bottle to the general, whose eyes narrowed suspiciously. "Go on," Kane said. "It's not poison." The general hesitated, then twisted off the cap. The carbonation hissed like a whispered secret. He lifted it to his lips. The sweetness startled him, a taste both foreign and alive. A few soldiers laughed, not cruelly but with the ease of boys who'd already won. Soon, others followed, passing out bottles to each prisoner. The heat, the exhaustion, the weight of defeat, for a brief moment all softened under the clinking of glass and the fizz of soda. Some Germans refused at first, wary of the gesture. Others drank cautiously, then found themselves taking another sip as if testing the boundaries of this strange civility. One general, his uniform threadbare but his posture still proud, muttered, "Amerikanische Ironie," American irony. Yet when a soldier returned carrying a tray of melting vanilla ice cream, even he could not hide his bewilderment. The men accepted it, hands trembling slightly, watching the white swirls melt under the Texas heat. To them, ice cream was a delicacy of peace, something they hadn't seen since before the war. For the guards, it was an ordinary day. For the prisoners, it was the first time in years that an act of mercy came without motive. They had expected vengeance, chains, shouting, punishment. Instead, they found abundance. One German colonel quietly murmured to another, "If this is defeat, perhaps we misunderstood victory." In the command post nearby, Lieutenant Frank Dorsey filled out paperwork, glancing occasionally through the window. He'd fought in France, seen the destruction the Wehrmacht had left behind, the burned villages, the bodies on the roadside. Yet here, under the same flag that had marched through Normandy, his men were handing out soda and smiles. It wasn't about forgiveness. It was about confidence. America could afford kindness because it had nothing to prove. That evening, the sun dipped low over the camp, turning the sky a deep gold. The German officers sat in quiet clusters outside their barracks, some still holding empty Coke bottles like relics. Beyond the fences, American soldiers played cards and joked under lantern light. A few of the younger Germans stared at them curiously, not as enemies, but as men of a world they didn't understand. In the silence that followed, one of the senior generals spoke softly to his adjutant. "Our Führer promised glory," he said, "but he never promised ice cream." The younger man didn't smile. He only looked down, ashamed of the years lost to madness. The air cooled with nightfall. The smell of pine and campfire smoke drifted across the compound. Somewhere a harmonica began to play, an old American folk tune. The generals listened, each lost in thought. Some remembered their own sons, still missing in the ruins of Europe. Others wondered what kind of nation could conquer its enemies and still offer them sweetness. By the time the lanterns dimmed, the first traces of disbelief had turned into something quieter: reflection. The generals realized they weren't prisoners of cruelty. They were witnesses to a civilization far different from what their propaganda had painted. Their world had collapsed in violence. This one hummed with abundance and confidence as if war had never touched its soil. Private Simmons, walking the evening patrol, paused near the officers' quarters. He watched one of the Germans gently set his empty bottle on the ground, careful not to break it. The young soldier couldn't explain why the sight struck him, perhaps because it looked less like surrender and more like acceptance. Inside the mess hall, the freezer hummed softly. A few tubs of ice cream melted slowly, forgotten. Outside, the stars stretched across the Texas sky, silent witnesses to the strangest peace imaginable. And just before midnight, a soft wind moved through the camp. It carried the laughter of distant guards, the whisper of crickets, and the faintest rattle of empty glass bottles against the dirt. Somewhere, one of the generals sat awake, staring at the stars. He whispered in German, almost to himself. So this is how an empire ends, and with music, sweetness, and silence. He didn't know it yet, but this moment, this afternoon of Coca-Cola and ice cream, would linger in memory longer than the battles of his past. And tomorrow, when they would wake to another day behind wire, something in their hearts would already begin to shift. The morning after the ice cream and Coca-Cola, the camp settled into a strange rhythm of civility. A pale sun rose over the barbed wire, lighting the dewy grass and wooden watchtowers, while the captured German generals stood for roll call in crisp lines. Their uniforms, though faded, still carried traces of rank: iron crosses, gold braid, a stubborn echo of a vanished empire. They looked toward the horizon, where freedom shimmered like a mirage. For men who had commanded nations, obedience now meant standing quietly before boys who called them sir. By mid-morning, a military jeep rattled through the camp gates carrying a new batch of newspapers and Red Cross bulletins. The headlines, written in English, were meaningless to most of the Germans. But one of the guards, Corporal Ernest Hale, a lanky kid from Ohio, spoke enough German to translate. He read the headline aloud: "Hitler dead. Germany surrenders." The generals didn't move. They'd known it already, yet hearing it in an American accent made it sound final. For years, they'd been told the Reich was unbreakable, that America was weak, decadent, incapable of true war. But here they were, standing on foreign soil, drinking American coffee and listening to swing music. At noon, a Red Cross officer arrived to brief the senior prisoners. He explained their rights under the Geneva Convention: letters home, medical care, fair rations. The Germans listened in rigid silence. When he mentioned recreation and education programs, a few exchanged puzzled glances. One finally spoke. "Education, for us?" The officer nodded. "If you wish. English classes even." There was a moment of awkward laughter, half disbelief, half relief. A people trained to believe the world was their enemy were now being offered lessons in the language of their captors. Elsewhere in the camp, American guards were gossiping about their prisoners. Some found it amusing that men with chests full of medals now queued up for cornbread and beans. Others felt uneasy. These were, after all, the same men whose orders had sent thousands to their deaths. But Sergeant Walter Kane, the same man who had handed out the Coke bottles, had a simpler view. "You beat a man fair. You don't need to break him," he told his men. "That's the difference between us and them." His tone was firm but not proud, as if reminding them that the real victory wasn't in domination, but in restraint. In the following days, the camp's routines revealed a deeper irony. The SEO, German officers were fed 3 times a day: eggs, meat, bread, butter, more than many civilians were eating back home in Europe. They received pay for light work and could buy small comforts: tobacco, candy, even more Coca-Cola. Word spread among them that this camp, Herne, was called the Fritz Ritz by locals. The nickname stung, but it wasn't entirely false. Compared to the ruins of Hamburg or Dresden, this fenced-in Texas outpost felt like paradise. Yet beneath the surface, a quiet disorientation grew. The generals couldn't reconcile the America they saw with the America they had been taught to despise. Nazi propaganda had been relentless. Posters and speeches painted Americans as mongrels, decadent consumers enslaved by greed and race mixing. Goebbels' voice had thundered across German radios. These are not men of discipline or honor, they are merchants of chaos. But now, these merchants saluted politely, shared cigarettes, and treated even their enemies with decency. One evening, a young lieutenant among the prisoners, formerly a staff officer in the Wehrmacht, was heard muttering to himself. How can they be so careless and still win? His superior, an older general with a thin gray mustache, replied, because they have no fear. Only nations that fear need control everything. The younger man didn't answer. He stared at the guard tower, where two Americans were joking and throwing cards into a hat. Their laughter carried on the warm wind, light as dust. Letters began arriving from Europe, carried by the Red Cross. Some told of ruined cities and lost families. Others spoke of disbelief, that prisoners in America were gaining weight, receiving mail, and listening to orchestras on the radio. One wife wrote, "If only our people were treated so." Her husband, a colonel in the camp, folded the letter carefully and stared at the Coca-Cola bottle on his desk. The label's red script seemed to mock everything he once believed about civilization. The camp's chaplain, a soft-spoken Methodist minister, began holding Sunday services. He spoke of forgiveness, of the strange mercy that comes after victory. A few Germans attended, sitting stiffly in the back. They didn't understand every word, but the tone, the warmth, moved them. One later admitted in a journal, "It is as if we are being taught humanity by those we thought had none." That journal would survive the war, preserved in an archive decades later, its pages yellow but its ink still sharp. Outside the wire, Texas life went on as usual. Farmers harvested crops. Coca-Cola trucks rattled down highways, and newsreels in local theaters showed smiling soldiers returning home. For the Americans, the war was ending. For the Germans, it was only now beginning to make sense. Every small act of kindness, the food, the music, the laughter, became a reminder of what their own country had lost. That summer, temperatures soared above 100 degrees. The prisoners were allowed to work in nearby fields, picking cotton and repairing fences. Local farmers sometimes watched from their porches, surprised at the sight of Hitler's men sweating under the Texan sun. In time, some even shared water with them, then iced tea, then small talk. One farmer's wife, curious and unafraid, brought them slices of pie. "Never seen men so polite," she later told a reporter. They said Danke like it was a prayer. Inside the camp, guards hung American flags from the barracks for Independence Day. The general stood by the fence, watching fireworks burst over the prairie night. The noise made some flinch, reflexes born from years of bombardment. But when the sky filled with red, white, and blue sparks, one of them whispered, "It sounds like victory, but not ours." The others didn't answer. They just watched as the last flare drifted down, fading into darkness. As July turned to August, the tension between old belief and new reality deepened. The men who had preached order and superiority were now learning humility from boys who barely knew geography. They had expected chains, but were given choices. They had expected hatred, but received humanity. The paradox gnawed at them quietly, reshaping what they thought they knew about power. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low, a Red Cross visitor asked a captured general what surprised him most about America. The man paused, staring at the horizon. "I was told your people were weak," he said softly, "but you are strong in the ways we never understood." He turned away before the translator could respond. That night, as the camp lights flickered out, the radios hummed faintly through the still air. Somewhere in one of the barracks, a few Germans listened to American jazz on a smuggled station, pretending to hate it while tapping their feet beneath the bunks. The contradiction made them laugh quietly. For the first time in years, the sound wasn't defiant, it was human. Outside under the same Texas sky, Sergeant Kane finished his patrol and leaned against the fence, watching lightning flash on the horizon. "Funny world," he murmured, lighting a cigarette. "We fought a war to destroy hate, and ended up giving them Coke and ice cream." Far inside the camp, a German voice murmured the same thought in a different tongue. "They win not by the sword, but by the soul." Neither man could hear the other, but both knew the same uneasy truth. The real battle was no longer being fought with guns. It was being fought within the minds of men who had been taught to hate, and who now, to their own astonishment, found themselves learning how to feel again. By late August, the camp had become its own quiet world, an unlikely pocket of peace surrounded by wire and guard towers. The Americans called it routine, the Germans called it captivity, but to both sides it was something stranger: coexistence. The war in Europe had ended, yet here, beneath the Texas sky, another conflict was unfolding, one fought not with bullets, but with conscience. At dawn, the bugle's soft cry drifted across the compound. The prisoners lined up for roll call, boots crunching on gravel still cool from the night. The guards checked names against neat American lists, then nodded them through toward breakfast. The menu rarely changed: eggs, cornbread, coffee, but for men who had lived through starvation in the ruins of Europe, it felt like wealth. As they ate, flies buzzed lazily through the mess hall. A German officer, once known for his ruthlessness on the Eastern Front, now carefully wiped a smear of jam from the table and muttered, "Order must exist even in defeat." After breakfast, the prisoners marched to their work details. Some repaired fences, others harvested cotton for nearby farms. The irony wasn't lost on them: generals and colonels now laboring under the command of privates. Yet there was no humiliation in it. The Americans didn't shout. They gave instructions the way one might speak to colleagues rather than captives. And slowly something began to change. The Germans found dignity in labor, and the guards, seeing discipline without defiance, began to respect them. Among the prisoners, one man drew quiet attention: General Kurt Reinhardt, 60 years old, stoic, sharp-eyed, his posture still impeccable. He had served under Rommel in North Africa, and unlike others, he rarely spoke. But every evening, he walked the perimeter, hands clasped behind his back as if still inspecting his troops. The guards began calling him the Professor, because whenever an argument arose among the Germans over politics, blame, or honor, it was Reinhardt who ended it with a few calm words. Reinhardt's chief adversary in those discussions was Colonel Dieter Weiss, a younger officer fiercely loyal to the old order. Weiss still spoke of the Führer as if he had been betrayed, not defeated. "The Americans treat us well because they want to change us," he said one night in the barracks. "Do not be fooled. Kindness is another weapon." Reinhardt didn't answer immediately. He studied the light from a bare bulb above them, then said softly, "Maybe it is the only weapon that works." The room fell silent. Outside, the cicadas buzzed and the warm wind rattled the tin roof. Meanwhile, the camp's American personnel were changing too. Private Harold Simmons, who had once joked about the old men with medals, now found himself reading about Germany in the camp's small library. "Strange," he told Sergeant Kane one afternoon. "The more I learn, the less I hate." Kane grinned and spat into the dust. "That's how peace sneaks up on you, kid. You start understanding people you used to shoot at." By September, a subtle camaraderie had taken root. Baseball games replaced drills. German orchestras played in the evenings, the brass instruments glinting beneath the lanterns. Some guards even joined in, clapping along to waltzes they didn't know. The camp's fences still stood tall, but they seemed to mean less with every passing day. Letters home spoke of strange peace. "Our captors are fair," wrote one general. "Their strength lies not in cruelty, but in confidence." Yet beneath that calm surface ran a current of unease. The men feared what awaited them back home. Rumors spread that those returning to Germany were being interrogated, even punished, for perceived disloyalty. Reinhardt knew his truth would be worse. He had seen too much decency here to ever believe in the myths he once served. One night he confessed as much to the camp chaplain, who sat with him under the stars. "We were told mercy was weakness," Reinhardt said. "But if that were true, we would have won." The chaplain nodded but said nothing. In October, the War Department introduced re-education programs, screening films about democracy and freedom. The Germans watched silently. The footage of American elections, families, and schools seemed almost theatrical. But something in it struck them: the faces of people unafraid to speak. Afterward, a sergeant asked for their opinions. Colonel Weiss called it propaganda. Reinhardt disagreed. "If it is propaganda," he said, "then it is the first I've seen that celebrates choice instead of fear." Even the guards noticed the shift. The lines between conqueror and conquered were blurring into something far more complex. As autumn deepened, the camp transformed with the season. Cotton fields turned pale gold and the air grew cooler. Life inside became almost domestic. Prisoners tended gardens, built furniture, and traded hand-carved trinkets for extra rations. One morning, Simmons received a small wooden horse from a German craftsman. "A gift," the man said. "For your son someday." Simmons tucked it into his pocket, unsure why his throat tightened, but not all found peace. Weiss grew bitter, accusing his comrades of surrendering twice, once on the battlefield and again in spirit. He began organizing small lectures in the barracks, warning them not to forget who we are. Reinhardt attended one, listening quietly until the end. Then he stood, his voice calm but heavy. "If who we are leads only to graves," he said, "perhaps it is time to forget." The argument ended there, though it would echo long after. As winter approached, the war outside their wire faded from memory. The Americans began sending men home. Each departure was marked by silence and a strange ache. Some envied the ones leaving. Others feared what waited across the Atlantic. Reinhardt stayed behind, deemed too senior to release yet. He spent his evenings writing in a small notebook, noting not battles but gestures. How one guard always offered cigarettes to those who didn't ask. How a local farmer left fresh bread at the gate. "History," he wrote, "is built not only by power but by grace." One cold night, as fog crept across the camp, Reinhardt found himself unable to sleep. He walked along the fence, staring through the mist at the faint lights of the guard post. Sergeant Kane was there, coat collar turned up, sipping coffee. "Can't sleep either?" he asked. Reinhardt shook his head. "No, I keep thinking, perhaps this wire is not meant to keep us in, but to keep the war out." Kane smiled at that, handing him the mug. "Then maybe it's working." They stood together for a while, the sound of distant coyotes filling the silence. When Reinhardt finally turned to leave, he stopped. "Sergeant," he said, "when this ends, tell your son that his father once gave coffee to an old enemy, and that enemy never forgot." Kane nodded slowly. "I'll tell him," he said. As Reinhardt disappeared into the fog, the sergeant watched the outline fade, like a ghost returning to peace. The next morning, the general's bunk was empty except for a single item left on his pillow. A Coca-Cola bottle cleaned, its glass catching the first light of dawn. No one knew why he'd left it there. Some said it was a farewell, others thought it was a message. But for those who'd lived behind the wire, it meant something deeper, that even in captivity, the quietest wars are the ones fought inside the heart. When winter came to Texas in 1945, the camp quieted under pale skies and the smell of smoke from iron stoves. The guards wore coats now, and the prisoners stitched makeshift scarves from old uniforms. Frost glimmered on the barbed wire each morning, turning the war's edge into something almost beautiful. It had been months since the Coca-Cola afternoon, but the memory of that sweetness lingered, like a strange ghost of mercy that none of them could shake. For men who once commanded tens of thousands, captivity had transformed from punishment into reflection. General Reinhardt, now thinner but steadier, spent his mornings in the camp garden, pruning the wilted winter plants. He had started teaching English classes to younger officers, a quiet irony that did not escape him. His chalk-dusted hands trembled as he wrote words like freedom and mercy on a blackboard salvaged from an old storeroom. "These are not words of defeat," he would tell them. "They are words of rebuilding." Even Colonel Weiss, once defiant, sat in the back of those classes, pretending to scoff but listening all the same. The Americans had begun releasing some prisoners. Each departure brought cheers, then silence. Trucks rolled out toward the train station, carrying men whose eyes no longer burned with ideology but with uncertainty. Reinhardt remained one of the last to go. The guard said the paperwork for generals took longer. He didn't mind. In truth, he dreaded the return. America had disarmed him more thoroughly than any battlefield ever could. Christmas approached. Camp Hearn decorated itself without realizing it. Garlands of pine strung across the mess hall, paper snowflakes taped to the windows. The Americans played Bing Crosby on the radio. The Germans sang their old carols. Two melodies met over the cold air, one yearning, one humble. On Christmas Eve, Sergeant Kane walked through the camp carrying a wooden crate. Inside were glass bottles, Coca-Cola again, chilled this time with real ice chipped from blocks in the kitchen. "Tradition," he said with a grin, handing one to Reinhardt. "Can't let you leave without one last toast." Reinhardt held the bottle carefully, the glass cold against his calloused hand. Around him, men smiled faintly, remembering that first surreal day of arrival. He raised it slightly toward Kane. "To peace," he said. The sergeant nodded. "To what comes next?" They drank in silence. For a moment, the war seemed like something that had happened centuries ago. But beneath that calm lingered something harder to name, a guilt that no amount of kindness could erase. Reinhardt often lay awake at night, listening to the faraway whistle of trains. He thought of the cities he had seen burn, the villages erased by orders he had signed without hesitation. He had been taught to believe victory cleansed all sins. Now he realized defeat was the only thing that ever forced a man to look in a mirror. The Americans had not tortured him. They had left him with time, and time, he discovered, was the cruelest interrogator of all. Letters arrived from Germany in brittle envelopes. They spoke of hunger. As the truck pulled away, the other prisoners gathered near the fence. Some waved. Weiss stood apart, arms folded, jaw tight. Yet when Reinhardt looked back, he caught the faintest nod, a gesture of respect or maybe surrender. The road stretched ahead, dust rising in the cold air. Beyond the wire, freedom no longer looked like a battlefield, but like a possibility. Hours later, the convoy stopped at a small station where American civilians waited out of curiosity. Children stared at the German officers with wide eyes. A young girl approached and offered Reinhardt a paper cup of vanilla ice cream, her mittened hand trembling. "For you," she said shyly. He hesitated, then accepted. The sweetness was the same as before, gentle, unearned, humbling. Around him, other soldiers smiled at the sight. He thought of the irony. Empires built on steel, undone by kindness and sugar. The taste lingered as the train whistle blew, long and mournful. Through the window he saw the vast expanse of America, fields, barns, rivers, all untouched by war. In his chest something unmoored. He realized that victory did not belong to the strong or the righteous. It belonged to those who could look upon an enemy and still see a man. As night fell, the train rattled eastward. Reinhardt took out his notebook one last time and wrote in careful script. "I asked for water and they gave me Coca-Cola and ice cream. I asked for justice and they gave me dignity. Perhaps this is what real power looks like." He closed it gently, watching his reflection in the dark glass. Rubble and the cold winter of occupation. One came from Reinhardt's wife, written on thin paper. "Our son is alive. Our home is gone. Do they treat you well?" He stared at the question for a long time before answering. "Better than I deserve." When he sealed the envelope, his hands shook, not from cold, but from the realization that he meant it. As the year turned, news reached the camp of the Nuremberg trials. The Germans gathered around the bulletin board, reading the names of their former comrades, Keitel, Göring, Jodl, men who had once seemed untouchable. Some muttered in disbelief, others turned away. Weiss slammed his fist against the wall. "They are making examples of us." Reinhardt answered quietly, "No, they are reminding us." That night, he returned to his bunk and wrote a single line in his notebook. "Justice is not revenge when it teaches mercy." Weeks later, orders came for his transfer. He was to be repatriated through New York. The announcement stirred the camp. Even the guards grew solemn. When the day came, he packed neatly, folding his worn uniform with care. Before leaving, he walked one last time through the garden. The earth was frozen, the plants brittle, but a small green shoot had survived near the fence. He knelt, brushing the frost away. "Stubborn," he murmured, smiling faintly. At the gate, Sergeant Kane waited with a clipboard. "You've been good men," he said. "No trouble, no hate. Guess that's how wars are supposed to end." Reinhardt extended his hand. The gesture carried more weight than any salute. "If they all ended this way," he said, "perhaps we'd stop starting them." Kane hesitated, then shook it, a tired face, no longer the enemy of anyone. The train passed a small town where neon lights flickered outside a diner. Young couples danced to music on the jukebox, their laughter spilling into the night. He smiled faintly, realizing that the world had already moved on while he was still learning how to let go. As the wheels clattered beneath him, he leaned his head against the window and whispered a final prayer, not for Germany, not for victory, but for understanding. Outside, the land blurred into shadow and light stretching endlessly east. And somewhere beyond that darkness, an ocean waited, a mirror he would soon have to cross.